The Littoral and the Metaphorical, Psychogeography, Liminality, and English Seaside Towns, with me, Dr. Tom Sykes, Associate Professor of Creative Writing and Global Journalism at the University of Portsmouth. As Merlin Coverley proposes in his eponymous book on the subject, psychogeography resists easy definition. Are we talking about a predominantly literary movement or a political strategy, a series of New Age ideas, or a set of avant-garde practices? The answer, of course, is that psychogeography is all of these things. That's what Coverley writes. Taking the situationist intellectual Guy Debord's broad characterisation, the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organised or not, on the emotions and behaviours of individuals, as my point of departure, I want to argue that mine and Louis Netter's collaborative research project, published as a book called Coast of Teeth in 2023, has revealed some coordinates for a new textual-visual psychogeography of English seaside towns. Now, in this particular talk, I'm only going to talk about the textual aspects of this project, which was my contribution to the book, whereas Louis is an illustrator, and he is much better placed to discuss, and indeed he has elsewhere discussed, the kind of visual facets of Coast of Teeth. But nonetheless, the multidimensional model of psychogeography that we are interested in and want to apply to our project includes liminal features of littoral spaces that are distinct from those of what we call inland England, regions that have typically monopolised the attention of mainstream psychogeographers. In addition, we want to propose some novel metaphorical lenses through which contemporary English seaside towns can be usefully studied. Contemporary psychogeography and its kindred forms, and by this I mean really kind of, even though psychogeography has penetrated all kinds of media, really what I'm interested in talking about are really sort of variations or genres of narrative non-fiction. Sometimes these are called deep topography. This is Nick Papadimitriou's term for the kind of psychogeography that he practices. People like Joe Kennedy have talked about the new topographical memoir. There are various terms for it, but I think we can usefully just sort of group these together under that umbrella of psychogeography. But these, yes, so contemporary psychogeography and its related forms tends to focus on the English interior, with urban, rural, and so-called edgeland spaces privileged over the littoral. And there are multiple reasons for this that a sort of short presentation like this cannot really do justice to and can only briskly cover. The cultural theorist Joe Kennedy provocatively contends that much modern English place writing emphasizes rooting about in the long grass to help its readers embed themselves once more in their native soil. And this is, Kennedy means this is a response to contemporary, that often these texts are a kind of response to contemporary anxieties in Britain about national identity in an age of Brexit, multiculturalism, ethnic cultural diversity, and crucially to Kennedy's thesis, what he calls authentocratic middle-class liberal misperceptions about working-class patriotism, members of which are putatively more interested, and I quote Kennedy again, in missile systems and the Queen's well-being. This being published a couple of years ago when there was a Queen instead of a King, not that it makes too much difference, I suppose. Such socio-political concerns are pegged to sites, traditions, and activities that are apparently quintessentially English or British in this genre that Kennedy is identifying. Most being located physically and conceptually far from the coasts, Kennedy summarises them thus, in a kind of somewhat sardonic way: species, rabbits, dragonflies, kestrels, or topographical features, meadows, hedgerows, haystacks, or earthy practices, wild swimming, woodcutting, shepherding. For Kennedy, these somewhat middle-brow and derivative texts have been informed by much more adroit and ideologically less suspect writers, but who also happen to focus on inland England. Robert Macfarlane, of course, made his name with poetic meditations on primeval rural roots, while Alan Moore has justified his preoccupation with his hometown of Northampton because it is, he argues, practically equidistant from every coast, which means it is right at the centre of the country, and so all of England's inner conflicts have more or less passed through it. While they have ruminated on large bodies of water such as the Thames, Ian Sinclair and Nick Papadimitriou have invested more of their time and interest in trudging the edgelands that dismantle the traditional boundaries between countryside and city. However, a minority of psychogeographers have more emphatically applied a model of liminality to spaces between land and sea. In his semi-fictionalized travelogue, Walking to Hollywood, Will Self, who incidentally kindly endorsed mine and Louis' book Coast of Teeth, recounts a visit to Spurn Head off the coast of East Yorkshire, whose very physical existence is liminal. It is continually appearing and disappearing due to being composed of shingle and clay that is displaced around the sea by longshore drift. This constantly wavering landmass, as Self calls it, is for Self a symbolic expression of the ambiguity of other states, borders, and categories relating to space and particularly time. The core of the present would be consumed, and the simple past would be all that there is or ever can be, he writes, quite late on in the book. The quandary has a profoundly personal dimension, given that Self suspects he is suffering from cognitive impairments that are symptomatic of early onset dementia. Luckily, it turns out that he isn't suffering from dementia. In similar mode, Rachel Lichtenstein's 2016 book, Estuary, individualizes the psychogeography idiom by directly associating her own psyche, troubled as it is by depression and the disorienting side effects of painkillers, with the various liminalities of the Thames estuary. She encounters ambiguous, treacherous terrains, wetlands come industrial zones, the hauntology of old world seafaring superstitions and eccentric occupations that have defied fashion and historical change, tugboat captains, mudlarkers, people like that, and varieties of crime and enemy, smuggling, which includes smuggling and ecocidal building practices that seem to emanate from the estuary's arterial positioning between the bustling metropolis of London and international waters drawing in trade, investment, tourism, migration, but also pollution and, rather more sort of negative aspects too. Inspired by literal-minded place writers like Self and Lichtenstein, we wanted in Coast of Teeth to develop the psychogeography of seaside towns by suggesting additions to the repository of metaphors that can be used to comprehend such locations. While such an approach may seem unscientific or in other ways epistemologically lacking to the literal-minded social scientist or geologist, there are a number of virtues to a more creative engagement with the ontology of seaside towns. Ian Sinclair has said that he learned from the Situationists how to invoke metaphors, similes, and other fictive devices to render his impressions of a multifaceted, contradictory, and contested London. I liked their notion, he writes, of creating a walk that would allow you to enter into a fiction. Our other point of epistemological departure is this suggestive observation by the cultural geographer Dorian Massey. Rather than, and this is a quote, longish quote from her from a 1991 article that she wrote, rather than thinking of places as areas with boundaries around them, they can be imagined as articulated moments in networks of social relations and understandings, but where a large proportion of those relations, experiences, and understandings are constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself, whether it be a street, locality, or region. To apply these thoughts to coastal psychogeography, while a seaside town may be determined as such by its administrative borders or material geography, in other important conceptual ways, its territory expands to incorporate ideas and images from elsewhere. Some seaside towns achieve this by bearing the marks of importing overseas cultural, aesthetic, culinary, and other influence due to their networks of social relations, as Massey puts it, that extend far beyond the territorial limits of seaside towns as conventionally defined. In the book that disseminated our research findings, Coast of Teeth, I point to several such sort of, as it were, imported aspects of foreign, or at least untypically English culture, some of which are relatively banal, others more socially and economically grave. Torquay's motley skyline, as I call it, is a postmodern palimpsest of myriad architectural styles bespeaking dissonant times and places. In the marina that takes a U-shaped bite out of the town centre, I write, we gaze up at a rocky height of stucco condominiums that could be Marseille or Cadiz. But the buildings below them don't feel very Southern European. There's the Torquay Pavilion's Anglo-Indian domes, a typically seasidey big wheel, a modernistic church. Appealing, vacant Debenhams has fallen victim to the slow death of England's high streets. There is also something transnational and transhistorical about almost all shoreline settlements, again, as I put it in the book, being trapped in the culinary time warp of the transatlantic 1950s, milkshakes, burgers, hot dogs, pulled pork, endless cups of coffee, endless cups of tea, full English breakfasts, bacon sandwiches, tea cakes, scones. Later on, in a manner which extrapolates the figurative from the literal, as in literal, further to Ian Sinclair's methodology of converting a physical walk into a fictional construct, I speculate that the real-world function of some English seaside towns as points of particularly commercial international exchange might have made them more susceptible to the influence of foreign culture and aesthetics, now represented in eccentrically anomalous architecture and cuisine. During our trip to the depressed Essex towns of Jaywick, Seawick, and St Osyth, I comment on the trailer parks and shanty-style dwellings lacking mains, gas, or electricity that are redolent of developing world poverty. And I write, I look out to sea and imagine the constituent parts of a poorer, tougher part of the world, drifting in and washing up on these shores, in order to make Jaywick resemble the global south that Louis and I have travelled to, rather than the comfortable global north that is our home. The psychogeographical metonym here is arguably specific to the seaside, the physical process of objects literally drifting onto land via the ocean waves, is adapted into a device for figuratively representing the decline of British living standards. Unlike the Torquay example, though, it is not so much that Jaywick can be seen to have imported, symbolically or otherwise, facets of the foreign. Rather, the locations of some seaside towns on the furthest edges of a small island nation, and therefore positioned literally and figuratively closer to the rest of the world than to the English interior, might make them a sort of bellwether, as the first communities to register and embody certain shifts in global power and wealth. As I put it in the book, perhaps Jaywick is an omen for what the rest of this country will become as Britain's slide continues amid Brexit aftershocks, a rising China, and a floundering America to whose fortunes we've pegged ourselves for long enough. Elsewhere in Coast of Teeth, I reflect on how the psychogeographical apprehension of a seaside town can, as it were, eclipse its ontological status as a site in the phenomenal world. In a highly autobiographical passage that was inspired by Self's and Liechtenstein's self-analyses, I narrate the rise and fall of my hometown Hayling Island as a seaside resort in the mid to late 20th century. By the 1980s, Sina and Hayling's 3 other holiday camps couldn't compete with those package holidays to Mallorca, and this spelled the effective end of Hayling's touristic appeal. But, as I write, my generation wouldn't let go of the idea of Hayling as a beach bum's wonderland, even if the reality was less ritzy. I explain how by sporting dreadlocks, buying VW vans and attempting to surf, my peers constructed a simulacrum of a seaside town inspired by an imagined littoral geography cannibalized mostly from Australian soap operas of the time. However, this was a far cry from the more prosaic social and geographical constitution of Hayling's failing economy, and its waves, as I argue in the book, were not exactly of Bondi Beach vintage. The relationship between the former and latter narrative is comparable to Jean Baudrillard's definition of the second of the successive phases of the cultural or aesthetic image, which masks and perverts reality rather than functioning as a reflection of a basic reality. Just as for Baudrillard, simulacra come to be more culturally and psychically significant than the material phenomena they are based upon, so arguably a certain perception of a seaside town can momentously capture the popular imagination and construct a hegemonic mythology, despite defying empirical truths about the site that are typically more within the purview of the conventional economist, sociologist, or marine scientist. In addition to these observations, in the hailing chapter, I deploy another permutation of spatial metaphor regarding unorthodox attitudes and beliefs. The physical distance of seaside towns from inland centres of media, politics, and learning, think of the big cities of London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc., perhaps results in their denizens being more susceptible to misinformation, hoaxes, and irrational conspiracy theories. Certainly in our fieldwork, we encountered a suspicion of metropolitan elites among some coastal dwellers, which appeared to fuel this passion for fringe worldviews. Biological racism, Freemasonry, and right-wing historical revisionism are prominent coordinates on my psychogeographical map of Hailing Island. Such forms of alternative thought and knowledge, however dubious, can often be uncovered by that methodology so vital to the psychogeographer's craft, the dérive, or unstructured, unplanned walk. The benefits of the dérive are summed up by Coverley thus: the promotion of swift circulation and the street-level gaze that walking requires allows one to challenge the official representation of the city by cutting across established routes and exploring those marginal and forgotten areas overlooked by the city's inhabitants. Our lengthy dérive across the Jurassic coast permitted us exactly the kinds of insights to which Coverley refers. By walking rather than being bounded by the established routes of roads or railways, we were able to spot more misinformation that challenged the official representation of the area in the form of anti-vaccination graffiti and stickers and posters critiquing council decisions to sell off public land. Some of these signifiers of marginal or forgotten people and attitudes were only accessible to walkers, for instance down some steep verge that no motorist or train passenger could infiltrate. For those committed to attaining a more holistic, multifaceted comprehension of a place, in order to develop the sorts of metaphorical prisms that are essential to psychogeography, walking, as I have averred elsewhere, allows a degree of peripheral vision not available through the narrow frames of car or plane windows. When you walk, you have more control over your own pace. You can pause for as long as you like without fear of being whisked to the next destination by your pilot or driver. It's also easier to interact with your environment when you're on foot. When in a private car or on public transport, you can only get so close to passers-by you want to talk to or places you wish to explore. I hope to have shown how the above theoretical approaches and research methods have pointed the way to a new psychogeography of the seaside. Moreover, these techniques deliver a more expansive and experiential conception of the seaside than perhaps can be attained by the more empirical and programmatic approach of the conventional journalist, government analyst, or scientist. The data we have generated foregrounds the poetic and the metaphorical over the phenomenal and the mathematical. We believe there is scope for evolving these methods to gain insights into other temporal and spatial characteristics of seaside towns that Coast of Teeth has necessarily excluded due to limitations of time and budget. Our other future intention is to adapt our methods to other national and regional contexts to aid the development of qualitatively and texturally different psychogeographies of, say, the American or Irish littoral. Thank you.